Thanks again for coming, and please join me as we give a warm welcome to Kate O'Neill.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone. Hello, fellow humans. Wait, actually, I guess I should check and make sure, are there any robots here? Any robots? Raise your hand if you're a robot in the audience. I don't see any, so I think we're safe to proceed. But I ask this question every once in a while because I figure one of these days there's going to be kind of a little spindly mechanical arm that comes up when I ask that question. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do at that moment, if I'm supposed to invite the robot to come up here and take my job, because that's kind of how we talk about robots and automation and AI and everything these days, is like with this fear, this dread about what it's going to mean for human jobs, for humanity, for kind of existential reality as we know it. So my premise has been to think about how we can make technology better for humanity, better for our future, and of course, better for serving business purposes. But in doing so, I think we have to start back from one of the foundations, and that is to think about what it is that makes us human. What is it that makes humans human? So I'll ask you to indulge me and just think for a moment of a word or a characteristic that you feel like really captures the human experience. Like, what one characteristic is it? And I won't have you call it out or anything, but just hold it in your head for a moment. What do you feel like it is that really makes humans human? And so let me ask, how many of you, by a show of hands, thought of something like creativity or problem solving or innovation or something like that? Anyone? No one? Oh, okay, a couple people in the room. Good, okay. So that's a pretty common answer. How about, this is a more common answer, I think. Empathy or love or compassion. Anyone? Yeah, okay, a few more hands. Those are both great, I think, great characteristics and admirable qualities of humans. I didn't necessarily specify that these needed to be uniquely human attributes, but I do think if we think about those, they don't feel like they are uniquely human, right? Like, we've seen creativity and problem solving in non-human animals, like otters bang mollusks on rocks to open them, and ravens use tools. And we've seen compassion and love from elephants and dogs and other species. So we know that those are exhibited by other animals. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine that in the not too distant future, we might see at least superficial indications of machines exhibiting those kinds of qualities in their behavior interactions with humans, and maybe even eventually other machines, which will be very interesting at a surface level. But how many of you, when you think about what that most human of characteristics is, thought of checking a box? Anyone? By a show of hands? Of course you didn't, because it's absurd. But this is the sort of premise, the problem that we encounter in technology a lot of the time, is that we don't necessarily think through this kind of foundational experience, and we are presenting absurdities as if they are sort of foundational truths. And besides which, if we were to try to claim that this is a uniquely human characteristic, we get beat out anyway by machines who can also do this characteristic. So I don't know how many of you have seen this little Giphy guy, but he's kind of fun. So I have come to be known as Tim mentioned, the Tech Humanist, and I take this this sort of moniker pretty seriously, because I feel like there is this area around which technology does have the capacity to solve human problems. It also has the capacity to scale, like we are experiencing automation and AI and all kinds of other emerging technologies bringing scale to the types of solutions we create like never before. And so I think it behooves us to really think about what the human experience around that scale is going to be, and what the human experience around technology is going to be, and how we can make technology better solve business problems and solve human problems at the same time. So as I talk about being a tech humanist, and as I think about solving those challenges, I'm excited that you all are in this room and on the live stream and watching on the video later, I hope. And then I want to offer that perhaps that is also you, that you maybe also are a tech humanist. And I'd like to offer that term to you so that when you see my book, as Tim mentioned, just came out September 24th, Tech Humanist, that you will see that title and think, I'm describing you as well, because that is the truth. I'd like to see us all sort of join hands in this movement to create more human technology and more wide-scale human experiences that are more meaningful and more integrated and more dimensional with the technology we create. So the premise there is, how can we both make technology better for business to solve business challenges and make it better for humans? And I think that both and framing is the key to the whole thing. We need to understand how to accept that these things do need to be integrated together. And I would propose that the way to accomplish this at scale is to focus on creating more meaningful human experiences at scale. So how do we focus on getting that meaning into the human experiences? So the way that looks in the model that I propose is this. On one hand, how can we think about scaling business meaningfully through data, through strategic alignment and automation? How can we think about using the tools at our disposal to make business more effective, while also creating more meaningful human experiences and scaling those through data and automation? I've had the opportunity to test this idea with a lot of different companies that I've consulted with, spoken with, advised, worked with on different projects over the years. And I'm excited to say that it works in almost every industry I've encountered. It sort of provides great results no matter who you are or what you're trying to accomplish. Every company is trying to achieve profit, right? Every company is trying to achieve revenue-based metrics in what they're going about. Even if you're a nonprofit organization, you still have to be accountable to some sort of profit and loss scenario. There's some sort of breakdown of the financials that you need to be accountable for. And I'm happy to tell you that the work of creating meaningful experiences actually does lead to increased employee retention, decreased customer acquisition costs, increased loyalty, and all kinds of other directional metrics that lead to more profit. Of course, it's also the right thing to do. It also creates a better experience for all of us. And I want everybody to be motivated by, kind of this aesthetic of wanting the world to be better and creating more meaningful experiences being its own end. But if we have to be motivated by profit, we can be. And that's all a good thing too. So let's unpack this just a little bit. What I mean when I talk about creating meaningful human experiences at scale, what does that entail? So first, let's think about what meaningful really is. So the example of the click the box to confirm your humanity, I mentioned I think that's an absurd example. And I have this kind of running hobby of appreciating the tension between meaning and absurdity in the world. That I feel like anywhere there is a lack of meaning, it sort of opens up this void into which absurdity can flow. So where we don't create enough meaning, where we don't describe enough meaning, we allow absurdity to flourish. So there's enough opportunity for that in technology as it is, and business really. I think you all probably have this experience, I'm guessing, that there are areas where, let's say you talk about work things in ways that you wouldn't talk about with your friends outside of work. You use language or terminology that your friends who don't work with you would not understand. Or there are things that you do at work that just that are kind of like, that's the way we've always done it. But anytime you think to yourself, this doesn't make sense, that's a really big clue, because making things make sense is what meaning does. So we have an opportunity to step back and assess absurdity and recognize that we can infuse meaning into those structures and create more opportunity to avoid meaning, to keep away from meaning. So the reason that works, I believe, is because humans crave meaning more than any other characteristic. So if you were to ask me what I think makes humans human, this is what it is that we seek meaning. In all areas of life, we are compelled by meaning. If you offer us a meaningful answer or solution, we are compelled by it. How many of you are Douglas Adams fans? Anyone? A few, okay. So you already know where I'm going to go with this. In the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, the answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything was 42, of course. So Douglas Adams wrote or said in interviews that he chose 42 because it was not too high and not too low of a number, and because it was just funny, and it is. But I don't know if you know this, but on Reddit, you can find this and a few other places collected around the web. There are kind of collections of alternate explanations for why 42 actually kind of makes sense as the explanation of meaning in the world. So for example, there are 42 characters in the phrase, "It's the answer to life, the universe, and everything." So, right? You're convinced now, right? No, or also there's like 42 dots on a pair of dice. So that answers everything, which I thought was just kind of a throwaway explanation. But my husband said, well, life is kind of like a roll of the dice. So I thought, well, all right, fair enough. There's this, my favorite of them is this. 42 is apparently the Unicode value for the asterisk character, which, as you may know, is a wildcard symbol often in computing, which means it can mean anything, right? But okay, so that's obviously just a coincidence because Douglas Adams didn't mean it that way, right?
That makes it sound like it's some kind of associative machine, finding meaning in senseless things.
But that's the important point, is that even though Douglas Adams didn't mean it that way, and it is just a coincidence, it is an absurd and poetic and beautiful coincidence, but we always make meaning the way we have always done and always will, which is by ascribing different significance to different events based on how and how much we value them, or in other words, by making it up as we go along. And I think that's the encouraging thing about this, is that even though we talk about robots and automation and AI in the broad mainstream in a scary way, what this suggests is that there is this kind of open interpretation to the future. We get to make meaning for the future as we go along. We get to decide the future as we go along. You get to decide the future as you go along. And that's really incredible, because right now, the possibilities, the power of what's happening within technology and within the scale of emerging technologies means that we have the capacity to create the best futures for the most people. There's really this potential, and I think even an ethical responsibility, to think about how solutions can scale to that sort of level. So let's go back to unpacking create meaningful human experiences at scale. And what is it that human experiences really describes? We talk a lot in business about customer experience, user experience, or depending on your industry, maybe patient or guest or visitor experience, student experience. We don't often, in many industries, talk about human experience in this integrated way, in this way that brings all of those roles together and appreciates the fact that there is this kind of holistic human experience that transcends any of those roles, that we are all of those roles at any given point in time. And so even though you may be performing as a customer in a customer experience, you are still a human coming into that customer experience. And the important thing about that is the transcendent empathy that can come from understanding the baggage, the context that someone brings to that interaction. So there's an opportunity to create these more dimensional interactions, these more integrated interactions. And so to create more meaningful human interactions, it turns out we need to design more integrated human experiences. We need to think about how to blend all of those roles and understandings together and bring an understanding of where someone has been, where you're meeting them in the world, and how you can create these kinds of senses of dimension and holism. So I promised a Venn diagram to a friend earlier, and I have it. The best Venn diagram in the entire world. I'm sure you all have seen this. If you haven't, you'll want to rush out and get this t-shirt right away. Tensor Graphics makes this Venn diagram. But the illustration here really, I think, gets at the point that when you think about what is possible on one side of an equation, such as the best technology or the technology to make business better, and what's possible on the other side of the equation, like what's possible to make technology better for humans, it's only by really thinking about the intersection of those things that you really come at the best solutions, like platypus keytar. You don't get platypus keytar until you're doing some serious both-anding. So that's the opportunity. And really what we're talking about is augmenting human experience with data and context. So the broader opportunity in a technology sense is to really think about where are you meeting someone in the world? What data do you have to understand and appreciate where they come from, what their preferences are, what their tastes are? And how can you create context that addresses the objectives that you have as a business and the objectives they have as a human, and the role that you're meeting them in, and the alignment of those objectives? Well, how can we come at that in a way that provides that? And so I actually kind of think of this in a way as being meaning as a service, in a sense. It's an opportunity to think about offering up a meaningful construct that aligns your objective and their objective, and providing the hooks, in a sense, to be able to expand upon that. And I really mean any meaning of meaning. So meaning, as we talk about it, could be at any level. We talk about meaning as it relates to communication. So I'm a linguist by education, so I think about the semantic layer, how we communicate with one another, what we convey across our communications with one another. But it can be all the way through, you probably spend a lot of your time, if you do a lot of development or engineering, in patterns and significance. That's probably a layer that you spend a lot of time in. But it could be all the way out to sort of the existential and cosmic layer. What is it all about, Alfie? That sort of thing. I think in a sense, it's almost like API thinking for everything. You can really sort of think about how one idea integrates with another, and how what is meaningful on one side, like the business side, can be meaningful on the human side of the equation. How do you provide sort of hooks and intelligence across those different parts of the experience, and make sure that that meaning is being transferred through that layer? The integration that most brought me to this realization is thinking about how the design of experiences online now regularly intersects with the design of experiences offline. That more and more, as we think about physical experiences, they come with some sort of digital component or some sort of trackability or traceability with that physical experience. Or when we think about digital experiences, we have to think about the physical context somebody might be in as they encounter those interactions. So I wrote about this in my last book, Pixels in Place. So thinking about things like the Internet of Things and wearables and beacons and sensors and all kinds of connected smart devices, and how those bring that sort of connective layer between those two worlds. But the important point about that is that just about everywhere interesting that the physical world and digital world connect, that connection layer happens through us, through humans, through our human experience. It's our movements, it's our behavior, it's our patterns, it's what we want, what we do, what we indicate, that really creates that connection. So again, it comes back to sort of thinking about that integrated human experience. So I proposed this model in Pixels in Place, which is integrated human experience design, thinking about how to blend those online and offline contexts, thinking about how to kind of come across all the different levels and roles of humanity that you might encounter, thinking about how to think about experience in an integrated way, interactions and transactions across all the different touch points that you might have. And note the way I'm defining the word design, which is the adaptive execution of strategic intent. So you have an intention, you have a purpose to what you're trying to do with any given design initiative, and you know that you're going to probably not get it exactly where you want it to be on the first go. So we need to build an adaptive, iterative process to this. And the more we do this around a framework of creating that meaningful interaction and that dimensional relationship between business, entity, and human that's consuming that experience, the more we stand a chance of conveying some sort of meaningful truth. So the elements of integrated human experience design, as described in Pixels in Place, I'll go through really quickly, because what I want to get to is that with Tech Humanist, I've actually built out upon this to a more automated understanding of experience. But within integrated human experience design in Pixels in Place, we look at integration, of course, that kind of comes along for the ride. So we're already talking about all these layers that are being integrated, the online and offline contexts. We're talking about dimensionality. So how does something come to life across different sort of touch points or ways in which you interact with people? How do the metaphors and cognitive associations come to life? What sorts of intentional things are you communicating through all of the choices that you're making about the language that you use, the iconography you use, and the cognitive associations you're bringing along with that? You're bringing along with that. Intentionality and purpose, so how have you defined what it is you're trying to accomplish? And that comes into play at a more holistic macro level as well, which we'll get to in just a moment. And a value and emotional load, like where are you meeting someone in the world? How challenging is that context? If you're designing for an encounter in a hospital, for example, it's going to be a very different type of value or emotional load than if you encounter somebody at a children's museum where they're having fun, hopefully having fun. Alignment is, of course, that sort of foundational principle of understanding what the business objective is and understanding the human objective and making sure that they are as tightly aligned as possible. And then adaptation and iteration being, of course, that process of making sure that we are building upon what we've learned. We're using experimentation and that mental model of building our learnings as we go. There's also this premise that experience has sort of two layers to it. If you think about human nature as this sort of ongoing truism, like we all have throughout time needed to drink water, for example. But then there's the shape of that experience and how it kind of gets packaged up and dimensionalized. And so you can see this bottle of water is an example of saying, well, if I were to put that water into sort of a heavy glass bottle and label it with some sort of minimalistic typeface sort of brand and create that whole aesthetic, and it has this kind of hipster vibe to it, maybe I feel like I'm being a more aspirational version of myself because I'm drinking maybe even the same water out of this cool bottle, and I feel like a better version of who I am than if I just drank it out of the tap glass or whatever. But so there's this kind of ongoing way in which shapes evolve. And it's important, I think, to recognize that as we create these integrated experiences, that human experiences do evolve, but the shapes will always change more readily than the nature. And it helps us get into contact and sort of create this continuity across time with the human nature that persists throughout the experiences that we're designing for, and yet be ready to adapt to the changing shape of experiences. So with that leads us into this opportunity to think about how machine-led experiences can actually be more meaningful. The more we're thinking about automated experiences and artificially intelligent experiences, how can we think about making sure that the humans that interact with those are having as much of a sense of meaning and significance and dimension to those? So what I proposed in Tech Humanist is that we don't just automate the menial, we automate the meaningful. I'll go through each one of these in detail, of course. That we automate empathy, that we use human data respectfully, and that we reinvest the gains in efficiency that we get in business from automation back into humanity and human experiences, at least at some level. And so we'll talk about each one of these. I'll start with this. I think a lot of times when we talk about automation, our base understanding is that we should automate meaningless things so that humans can do higher order tasks, which is a nice enough premise until you start thinking about that at scale and you start imagining a world in which all kinds of functions have been automated and most of our world is automated and most of our interactions are with machines and they've all been automated to be meaningless. So I think it's a yes and, a both and sort of scenario. We do need to think about automating the menial, meaningless functions to free ourselves up to think about higher order things. But we also need to think about what's working, what are human interactions that convey some level of empathy and nuance, that create some sort of significance and dimension, and how can we kind of work to automate those as well? How can we capture some of that significance in those automations? So in this way, we're talking about using data and technology to scale not just for efficiency, but for meaning, to think about ways that we can actually create a sense of dimension in the world around us. One way that works is I like to think about this model of this relationship between metaphor and metadata. And I think the easiest way to explain this is a slide I stole from Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, when he was demoing a couple of years ago the new campaign that they were launching at the time, which was the Don't Go There, Live There campaign. Anybody familiar with that? Did you guys run across that at all? So the idea was, even if it's only for one night, go to every place you visit as if you're a local. Treat that city like you're a local. And this slide was an illustration of how you could experience a different type of approach on TripAdvisor versus with the Airbnb approach of trusting the local experts. But note that, okay, so this is obviously Paris, and note that everything on each list is different except for one, which is the Luxembourg Garden, which is my favorite place in Paris, so yay me. But each of the other things on the TripAdvisor list is really just a brute popularity contest, right? It's all just what are the most sort of bucket list items that someone would associate with Paris. And on the Airbnb side, it's who has the most significant understanding of the city of Paris. What do they recommend as being the places that you sort of must visit and must experience in Paris? And what I think is interesting is when you think about the metaphor that's really underlying this, it's clear that the TripAdvisor metaphor is much more about this kind of casual tourist experience of the world, this kind of conventional understanding, right? Whereas the Airbnb thing is that sort of don't go there, live there, this knowledge of the expertise. And then the metadata clearly is it's like the same city. These are all the same landmarks. They exist in either case. But one is being rated for popularity and one is being ranked for this expertise or authority. So the way that these two sort of dimensions interact with one another creates this more meaningful understanding of what the company is trying to achieve and how it brings it to dimensional life for the person that's interacting with it. Because that meaning informs the purpose that the company is bringing to life in their experiences, and the purpose of the company that they're trying to bring to life sort of fosters the meaning that the person is going to experience when they interact with the touch points that the company creates, if they've done it well. And the nice thing about this, when you think about how this really comes to life in an automated, machine-led way, is that humans really, I think when you think about what the research shows, what we most thrive on is a sense of meaning and common goals and a sense of fulfilling something bigger than ourselves, whereas machines thrive on this sense of clear instruction, right? And what leads to both of those things is purpose. Now, I'm not talking about purpose like in this kind of touchy-feely, spiritual sense necessarily. I'm talking about purpose as a set of clear instructions or as a sense of clarity about what it is you're trying to achieve. And what that does is leads to this ability to kind of bring all your resources to bear in a very efficient way and to align all those resources, to set priorities very effectively and make sure that everybody is kind of rowing in the same direction. My favorite example of this, of companies setting a strategic purpose and really using it to operationalize around, is Disney theme parks. And from a digital transformation perspective, the My Magic Band program. How many of you have been to Disney World or one of the Disney theme parks since they've introduced this? It is pretty magical, right? So they've articulated their purpose statement as create magical experiences. It's really just those three words, create magical experiences. And so you think about across the organization, just about anyone in any function can understand how they can solve problems relative to their scope of their work as it relates to creating more magical experiences. Like a problem that's brought to them, they can just go, well, I know how to solve this, as long as the company actually sort of gets in line behind that and allows them the autonomy to solve the problem the way they need to. But think about that as it relates to digital transformation and deploying $1 billion program, which this was, that investment scale for the company. And you can do that with complete confidence, knowing that this magic band is going to allow people to be able to go around the park and use it as payment, use it as access, use it as sort of preferences and all kinds of information, that tracking that certainly gives a lot of useful information to the company as they sort of merchandise more effectively and so on. But that ability to translate the purpose into a deployment at $1 billion scale is very clear from that program. So we can design experiences that are aligned with strategic purpose so that we can actually see that understanding of purpose scale to massive levels. And purpose is the shape meaning takes in business. So that's how we get that meaning to be felt and understood at a human level. By the way, I keep talking about scale. So I want to unpack that a little bit too. So when we think about creating meaningful experiences at scale, normally when we talk about scale in like a startup or a corporate business, a corporate growth sort of scenario, we are talking about like removing hard limits so that growth opportunities can flourish And usually we're talking about that in terms of multiples, let's say, right? Like 3x or 4x or 5x or 10x if you're very, very lucky. But what happens when a notion meets nearly unlimited expansion possibility? When data can model it and software can accelerate it, and automation can amplify it, and culture can adapt it. And that's what really we're talking about with machine-led experiences. And that's why it's so important that we think about creating these in a more meaningful way, because if we don't create the meaning into the system, what are we doing? We're allowing absurdity to encroach, right? And we don't want absurdity to scale. So my favorite example of absurdity at scale is one that I don't mean to knock the program or the product, because I think it's incredible. The Amazon Go store. How many of you have experienced it in person? It's pretty cool, right? Like the idea that you can actually just walk into a grocery store, you scan your app as you go in, and then just pick up whatever you need and walk right out. And there's no, sort of checking out process. It just kind of knows, but through cameras and sensors and so on, it knows what you've picked up and what to associate with your account, and you're good to go. So obviously, we have to talk about cashier jobs and what that means for the future of human work as that goes to scale. But let's leave that set aside for just another moment, because right now what I'm focused on is something else. What happens when you open the app for the first time and you get this onboarding? It explains that as you pick things up off the shelf, the sensors know, what you've picked up, and as you put it into your basket or in your bag, that you'll be charged for it. So it says, don't pick up anything for anyone else, which is fine, except that you start thinking about, I don't know about you, but I get asked all the time to help people in stores. You seem pretty tall. You probably get asked for that. You get asked. And now it's like, okay, well, I can't really help that person get the thing off the shelf because it might charge me for it. And there's a way to get it charged back. And Amazon might fix this before it goes to scale. But really, like 3,000 Amazon Go stores have been announced before 2021. So if this doesn't get fixed, and if it is something that we all start adjusting our behavior and not helping other people in the Amazon Go store, well, that's the future of retail we're talking about. 3,000 Amazon Go stores by 2021 is going to mean that retail environments are going to be this cashierless environment before too long. And so we won't help each other in any stores. And how long is it before we don't help each other at all? And I know that sounds like hyperbole at some level, but what I mean to suggest is the idea that experience at scale does change culture. And I think that's important to recognize, because really experience at scale is culture. What we sort of all collectively agree to do with each other and how we agree to interact with each other is culture. And all of the work that we do creating human experiences sets that context and creates that modality. So that understanding is super, super important. So I do have a slide here, and if anybody needs these slides, I'm happy to share them. But a slide that asks questions, and it's in the book as well. If we were to try to deprogram the absurdity of not helping each other, we could ask some questions to step back from that and think, like, how do we not create experience at scale that's going to be absurd? How do we make sure that the brand isn't going to be impacted? If we create products or solutions that might scale in ways that are unexpected, how do we pivot to deal with that? What does that look like? So there's some questions we can ask to anticipate that. But primarily, I think the challenge is, or the opportunity is, to think about meaning and to think about keeping absurdity from scaling. This is a comic that was drawn for me by my friend Rob Cottingham to illustrate the sort of opposite of tech humanism. I don't know if you can read it. It says, "It's getting harder and harder to hold on to my humanity, but wow, is it easy to track my Amazon deliveries." And so, of course, that's absurd. But it's the idea that we aren't thinking about, what do we really want meaningful experiences to look like? What do we really want our future humanity to look like? How do we create technology solutions that amplify our humanity and don't get in the way of humanity? I think that's really what we're talking about. The second premise of machine-led, meaningful human experiences is to automate empathy, which again may sound like it's a contradiction, but I think there's an opportunity to think about the ways that any kind of experience that we design creates some kind of connection, and to to create as meaningful a connection as possible. So how many of you remember the Seinfeld episode where Kramer got a new phone number and it was 1 digit off from movie phone? Anybody remember this? So anybody remember movie phone? I know the app just sort of ended as of like a week ago, but in the 80s and 90s or whatever, we all had to pick up the phone and actually call a service to tell us what movies were playing. And in this episode, Kramer had gotten a new phone number. It was 1 digit off from movie phone. And it was obviously a touch tone service, so he couldn't understand the touch tones that he decided that he was going to impersonate movie phone. But he couldn't understand the touch tones, so he ends up just saying, "Why don't you just tell me what movie you want to see?" And I always find this to be such a prescient example of how we think about machine-driven interactions and how we think about what human-based interactions look like, the sort of relationship between those two. So I think of the movie phone Kramer model as a sort of agile deployment of emerging technology, that you can think about the robotic interaction and the human interaction as being somehow interchangeable with one another, so that you can actually use human interaction to gather patterns that you will encode as chatbots or other types of automation. And not to suggest that you would lie, that you would present a human and have it be posing as movie phone or whatever your equivalent is, but rather that you would have some kind of agile, human-based interaction that gives you the insights to be able to create scripts and create patterns that help you develop frameworks for automation. And of course, you're starting with if-then statements, but you're quickly trying to work beyond the if-then to get to the nuance. So if-then is easy to anticipate, right? In the kind of frequently asked questions model of automation, if you're saying like, that if you're automating, let's say, a chatbot for a bank, you know that a lot of your interactions are going to be about how to change your password, for example, or how to set up a new account. So if someone wants to create a new account, then here's the answer, and here's the sort of flow diagram that you can walk them through. But the nuance beyond that is, I need to change my password because my ex is stalking me and it's a dangerous situation, and there needs to be some human interaction there. There needs to be some human nuance to that experience. So that's more where the empathy gets automated into the process, is finding those types of interactions and finding the opportunity to build out the relationship between the automated and the human. And also when we're looking for patterns, that we're not just looking for arbitrary patterns and encoding those. Arbitrariness also sits in opposition to meaningfulness in much the same way that absurdity sits in opposition to meaningfulness. So we want to make sure that we're finding meaningful patterns and automating those. Because in all of the work that we do with this, we cannot leave meaning up to machines. Machines won't do meaning. That's just not something that machines are really equipped for. So it has to be humans that determine what is meaningful. And I love this example. I know many of you probably work around image recognition or AI, and so you know this dilemma very, very well. I know a lot of algorithms have advanced since this day, but the puppy versus muffin sort of problem is one of my faves, and it always gets a chuckle. I see some smiles in the audience. But it's true that subtle nuances aren't really where AI shines in many cases at this point, at least not at a meaningful recognition level. Not being able to say that the muffins all have this certain meaningful characteristic and the puppies all have this certain meaningful characteristic. Whereas I believe many of you are probably able to determine which one's a muffin and which one's a puppy pretty well. Here's some more, by the way. You know which one's a barn owl and which one's an apple. You're not having any trouble with that, I bet. Which one's a croissant? But I think this introduces an idea that there may be opportunities for humans to work alongside machines in ways that add nuance and empathy and understanding to the machine-led processes. Because humans generally do nuance pretty well. That's something that we are encoded for. We get meaning. That's what we're about. So we're able to add that into the value proposition. So when we think about the relationship between machines and humans as we move into the future of work and the future of that sort of economy, I think we're going to add the most value by being human and understanding meaning and nuance and understanding value and understanding each other and adding that layer to those interactions. So the third tenet of the machine-led meaningful experiences is to use human data respectfully. It comes from this idea that when we talk about digital transformation, I kind of feel like that's a little bit of a misnomer at some level, because we already made a digital transformation the moment we started spending all of our time in front of screens, transacting in bits and bytes with each other. So that's kind of a done deal. And what's really more meaningful than that is the data transformation, the fact that all of this is happening with a data layer behind it, that business has all kinds of data visibility and transparency through the supply chain, through logistics, through operations, and everything has this kind of clarity and transparency about what kind of trackability is going on, what's measurable and all that. So it's a really interesting layer to work with. But when we talk about digital transformation, including automation and digitization, all of that, all of the many nuances of that, fundamentally what we're talking about is agility with data. As companies become more digitally ready and digitally transformed, they're becoming more agile with database decisions. And that data that we're talking about is really our data. It's human data for the most part. Business data is largely about people. It's our purchases, it's our movements through space, it's our preferences, it's our, all of our tastes and indications that we've made. And really what I'm saying is analytics are people, right? At some level, for the most part, when we are looking at graphs and reports and so on, we're generally looking at the needs and interests and motivations of real people that are there buying from our companies and interacting with them and driving all of these decisions for us. And I think the flip side of appreciating that and treating that data with respect is understanding that what we encode into machines is really about us, that we are putting ourselves and our biases into the encoding, into the algorithms and everything that we create. So the opportunity, I think, as we look at this tech humanist future, is to encode the best of ourselves, is to think about how we can create our most egalitarian viewpoints and our most evolved understandings into the data we model, into the algorithms we build, and into the automated experiences that we design and create. So we can use our data, our human data, to make more meaning in the world. And we can recognize that the more we create relevance in the alignment between business objectives and human objectives, the more we are creating a form of respect. But that also, the sort of caveat to that is that discretion is a form of respect too. That we're also allowing people to, say, be forgotten by us and allowing them to take their data with them, and that we can not make people feel like we're creeping them out by knowing so much about them. And that we protect human data excessively. That we make sure we're being very, very, very careful with the data that we collect and use in business decisions, because we recognize that it is human data. The last point, and it's a quick one, because this may or may not be within scope for many of you, but that as we think about the gains that we make in our businesses through automation and machine-led experiences, that we think about reinvesting some of those gains into how to create more meaningful human experiences at scale. And I don't think it's really a mystery why that's so important. There was a study done, a couple of versions of a study done on what jobs are potentially considered automatable, and this is one visualization of the data from that study. That shows the different cities in the United States and how likely the jobs that are there are to be automated over the coming years. I zoomed in on New York, which is where I'm from, and you see 55% of jobs are considered potentially automatable. And you have to think about the socioeconomic impacts of that. You have to think about the psychological impacts of that. That humans have had a very deeply connected experience to work, that we've derived a lot of our sense of meaning and identity from work. We say who we are in terms of what we do. And we have names like butcher, baker, tanner, carpenter, and so on that derive from ancestral jobs that have been carried down through generations of our family. And that's true across cultures. So it's a really important thing to understand that jobs are kind of going to change. There's going to be job displacement, augmentation, and replacement by automation. And we don't yet know what that means for human meaning. And we don't yet know what that means economically. We don't yet know what that means, sort of socio-politically. And so there's a huge opportunity for us to take the gains that we make in automation and have this ethical contribution back into society, back to humanity, and say, like, what can we do to foster a sense of meaning and a sense of community and a sense of connectedness and a sense of more humanity with those gains? So I think we can also think about repurposing human skills and qualities into higher value roles. So as we automate, that one of the executives that was in a strategic workshop I led ran a utilities company in South America, and he found through our work an opportunity to automate a customer service function that was their most heavily accessed customer support question and function. And once he saw that opportunity, he saw that there was a way to take the humans that were working in that job and create oversight positions for them so that they could continue training the algorithms that were going to create that automation. So obviously, a very straightforward kind of replacement. It may not be a one-for-one. We may see job loss anyway. But some of that reinvestment is going to offer up higher value human roles. So here are those 4 tenets again. And I think the summary of this really comes back to, as you think about the work you're trying to do and how to create these more meaningful experiences through automation and through artificial intelligence and so on, it really comes down to this question of what is it that you are trying to do at scale. So that's the purpose statement. How can you articulate what it is your company is trying to do, your team is trying to do, you are trying to do at scale? And for me, the answer to that question is create more meaningful human experiences. It's just as simple as that. But the way that I can do that is by speaking with groups like yourself, working with executives, working with leaders, and being able to help them hone in on that purpose and really get clearer on how to create those more meaningful experiences that do align the business objectives with the human objectives, that do bring the business results, and that create a better future for humanity. So because business will have to scale through digitization and automation. Business won't be successful long-term without it. It's table stakes. But humanity won't be successful without meaning. So for that, I thank all of you for the work that you do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate. We have a Dory. There are no questions on it right now, so we can ask a few local questions, and if anything shows up, then we'll get those included too. But I see a hand right here, and can we get a mic over here?
I have the
for
mic.
us?
Test.
Or-
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your talk, first off. So for the rhetorical question you asked at the very beginning of the talk, I know a lot of people, if not most people I know, would answer a soul. What makes humans human is a soul. So what advice would you give about how to automate religion?
It's a very interesting question. I actually have talked with a few people about the work that they're doing around automation and creating experiences for people at scale around religion. And I don't feel like I'm in a really good position to be an expert on that. It's not the work that I do. But I do think that religion is fundamentally offering meaning, right? So really, we're talking about the same principles. We're talking about being able to offer people a lens into what is meaningful and then helping to scale that. So if there is a solution that someone is trying to build that is some sort of technology product for creating like a religious experience or a religious outlet for people or a community, then I think it really comes down to the same principles. It's just like religion is the industry in that sense, and we're trying to offer meaning through those experiences. That would be probably my best take on that. But I think it's a more interesting question than that at some fundamental layer, and it sounds like a discussion over beers or something like that. So, do we have another question? Yeah, to your left.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was really struck by your point about shared experiences forming culture, and obviously we in the technology world have a lot of, we increasingly kind of shape shared experience. So in the Amazon Go point about like people not helping each other, that's something we can all probably agree is a net negative, and even Amazon, I'm sure, would agree. But there's a lot of cases where we have the potential to shape culture where the answer really isn't clear. What is the right thing to do? Filter bubbles being like one controversial idea, whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm wondering, what's your take on how we should approach these problems? Like, what principles should we use in deciding how to shape culture or what processes or institutions maybe we need to make these decisions?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good and big question. I'd like to cop out and say that the entire book, Tech Humanist, sort of addresses it. But at some level, what it comes down to is trying to understand that sort of strategic purpose, that alignment between business objective and human objective. And I think if you're looking at a filter bubble type of example, as one example of something where like a social platform or an online community is fostering, or a media company is fostering through algorithmic content filtering and so on, this sense of disparity between people's collective understanding of what is truth. I think you can probably come to some understanding at some level of view of that the business objective, which may be advertising or something along those lines, and the human objective aren't aligned there. So I do think that there is still a useful framework there, but I do offer some additional ones in Tech Humanist as well. It is a really good and important question, and it's an important point for us all, I think, to consider in the work that we're doing, because there's so many net positives and net goods that come out of, let's say, with social media and the connectedness we have with each other, and the way we're able to maintain relationships with such ease versus 20 years ago. But of course, it does come with these sort of associated difficulties and the challenges of making sure that we're all sort of speaking the same language, which at the moment I believe we're not. We were having that discussion beforehand. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think there's a lot in the book, which I'll just keep pointing back to that does unpack that a little further. But I genuinely think that framework of understanding what it is the business is trying to accomplish and what it is that's good for humanity, how those things can be in line. And it doesn't have to come down to a humanitarian purpose. It just has to mean that we're not accelerating something that is not ultimately good for humanity. That I think is where the alignment comes back to.
Right, there's a question on the dory, and it's sort of similar to a question that I had, so I'm going to try to merge them together. The question is on the dory. It starts like this. Scale tends to force humans to reduce their variety to adapt to machines instead of the other way around. So further, what about ways to reduce scale that are compatible with business? You mentioned distributism, decentralization, or something else. And I'll add that I think that a lot of this technological change is really coercive, meaning either you get with it or you get left out, particularly around the job changes that you talked about. And like, how much is our responsibility to bring people along, like to offer the lifeboat? And how much do people really need to get in the boat?
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult thing to be able to break down in one side or the other, right? Like, I think that the change is coming no matter what. What we find, though, is the change is going to be disproportionately felt. So jobs that are most likely to be automated are jobs like truck driver, cashier, these types of things. And what we know is that statistically, those jobs are disproportionately held by people of color. So that not fair, not equal distribution is happening. So I think we do have an obligation, if we're trying to create the best futures for the most people, which is what I would say is one of the underpinning ideas or underlying ideas of Tech Humanist, that we have to be thinking about how to create a more equitable distribution of opportunity and how to make sure that the impact of automation is not going to destroy one set of humans' potential, and while it increases the potential for enrichment of another. So that inequity is going to become even more extreme than we've already experienced. So I think it's in our best interest as humans to think about how to sort of shift that and how to level that out. Not that people can't become wealthy, but that we don't create this even more extreme distribution than we already have. So I think to some extent it's imperative for anyone who's creating experiences, which is pretty much everyone that works in technology, that works around most fields that I've worked around, healthcare entertainment, and so on, to think about the change that's coming and how to make sure that it is that we're creating as much opportunity there as possible. But yes, I think there's also this kind of new emerging space around opportunities to retrain people and repurpose, get people to understand the new skills that they might have. I've shared some really great stats in Tech Humanist about programs that were taking, let's say, prisoners who had come out of prison programs and been able to retrain them into communities, jobs that they could keep. And there was 0.1% recidivism within this program. So I urge you to look into that example. There's just so many ways that I think an ecosystem of answers is really what's going on here. We have to own the responsibility as content creators and experience creators. And we also have to recognize that, this is going to be a broadly distributed, broadly felt thing that is going to have inequity to it.
So to bring back a word that Paul put in his question, decentralization. How does maybe decentralization help with this by spreading power around or control around? Maybe just talk about decentralization for a bit.
Well, I think the idea of spreading power around, spreading control around is interesting. Certainly, we have seen, through user-generated content, user communities, and platforms like Meetup, for example, we were talking about earlier, as one way that there's sort of tools that we can put in the hands of people that allow people to kind of create communities amongst themselves, create more human connection. Those are going to be, I think, increasingly important. And the technologies are there to sort of foster that and allow discovery within those communities, allow people to sort of find each other and connect more deeply. But I think we just have to be thinking mindfully about the challenge of not amplifying those sort of net negatives, as your question was alluding to earlier with the filter bubble and so on. So I'd love to hear more specifically what about decentralization might be what's sort of nagging on the person's mind that's asking the question, or on your mind there. So whoever's asking that, feel free to ask a secondary question.
Paul, yeah.
And if there's any other.
Or maybe for the sake of time, we look for one more question in the room before we wrap up. Anything else? Yes.
Oh, great. So I have a kind of a thought about some of this stuff in terms of, do you ever take your work and look at it as a lens of looking at humanity through the lens of what technology is revealing about people?
Yeah, I have looked at that, but I'm very curious as to what is occurring to you as you think about that.
Well, I mean, I used to do a lot of community management, and so I came out of, being on the BBSs back in the late 80s, early 90s, and so it's this kind of thing where I realized that a lot of what happened online was just what happened offline, but at a different scale and at different localities.
Yeah.
And that was sort of an aha moment for me when I was a part of these little communities, back in the BBS days. So it's just kind of like, as technology has become more and more prevalent in our lives, it's something that I kind of look at, almost flip the conversation a little bit in my own head of like, oh, what does it mean? What does it say about people, given how we're using?
Yeah, so I mean, it does kind of, a little bit of that points back to the decentralization discussion as well. But I like the aspect you brought up. One of the aspects of this that I have looked at is that it seems to me that our digital selves, that sort of aggregate set of characteristics that gets collected through our movements, through our connections, through our interactions in social spheres, that digital self is really our aspirational self, mostly, that we are saying who we most want to be. And it seems ironic to me that digital self is the version of ourselves that is most commodified by business and most capitalized upon and manipulated by business. I think in our physical manifestations, we are much less prone to that kind of manipulation and over-capitalization. Yet this digital self, which is our aspirational self, is prone to that. So I think this is the opportunity for us to kind of merge that understanding and say, well, it is a human that we're looking at in that digital, sort of collected aggregate data points. And so we need to be respectful about that too. So I think that flipped version is to say, there's this way that we're interacting with each other in a way that represents who we most want to be and who we most feel we are. So it's all the more reason why we need to be respectful with the data that we collect and monetize and use within business to inform our intelligent decisions in our systems. So I'd say that's exciting to me.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks, Google, for being a great audience for Kate. And I guess we owe us all a round of applause. So thanks.
Thank you.
And Kate, especially.